At breakfast, my daughter-in-law smiled and said they were moving into my penthouse to start over. My son nodded beside her, eyes down, as if agreement required no explanation. They spoke calmly, confidently, like the decision had already passed through every room of my life without needing my consent. I listened, stirring my coffee, feeling something familiar tighten in my chest. The quiet realization that I was being written out of my own home. They talked about timing, about space, about what made sense for them. No one asked what it would cost me. Later that morning, they arrived with suitcases and expectations. When the door opened and they stepped inside, everything stopped. No words, no movement, just the sound of their breathing and the weight of a truth settling in. In that silence, they understood they had crossed a line they could not step back over. Before I take you through how it happened and how it ended, I want to ask something personal. If you've ever been quietly displaced, slowly erased by the people who should have protected you, please consider subscribing and sharing your own story in the comments. Sometimes the only justice we get is knowing we weren't alone. They arrived early, which felt intentional. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee when my phone buzzed with a message saying they were nearby and thought it would be nice to talk somewhere public. Nice was never the word they used when they wanted something, but I agreed anyway. I still believed at that point that misunderstanding was possible. That clarity could be restored if we just sat down like adults. The cafe was already half full when I walked in. Morning light slanted through the windows, catching dust in the air, making everything look softer than it really was. I chose a small table near the wall. I liked having my back protected. Old habit. Years of negotiations teach you that much. Emily arrived first, moving with that practiced confidence she'd perfected over time. She wore neutral colors, tasteful, unthreatening. The kind of outfit designed to make other people comfortable while quietly asserting control. Mark followed a step behind her, shoulders slightly hunched, hands already folding together as if preparing to be still. She hugged me lightly, more gesture than warmth, and immediately began talking. About family, about healing, about how hard the last year had been on everyone. Her voice carried just far enough that I noticed the woman at the next table glance over and smile sympathetically. Emily had a way of speaking that invited witnesses, as if she wanted the world to see her trying. Mark didn't interrupt. He rarely did anymore. He sat beside her, eyes on the table, nodding occasionally like punctuation. I realized, sitting there, that this wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. I was the audience. Emily talked about starting over, about how sometimes families had to come together under one roof to reset old patterns. She said it gently but with certainty, like someone explaining a concept that had already been approved by committee. She mentioned my penthouse as if it were a shared resource, something temporarily underutilized, rather than the place I had chosen carefully after my wife died. When the server came, Emily ordered for all of us without asking. Coffee for Mark, herbal tea for herself, another coffee for me, black. She smiled as she did it, the way people smile when they believe they're being helpful. Then, when the bill came later, she paid it immediately, sliding her card across the table before I could reach for my wallet. It was a small thing, insignificant on the surface, but I understood gestures like that. I'd built a career watching people establish dominance in quiet ways. Paying the bill wasn't generosity. It was positioning. As she spoke, I noticed the people around us. The polite nods. The way the barista lingered nearby. To anyone watching, this probably looked like a devoted daughter-in-law trying to mend bridges with an aging father. Mark's silence only reinforced that image. He looked like a tired son letting the women in his life handle the emotional labor. I felt myself shrinking in that space, not emotionally, but socially. Reduced. Framed. I was no longer the man who had raised a son alone after burying his wife, the man who had built and sold companies, the man who paid his taxes early and kept his affairs in order. In that cafe, I was an obstacle to a narrative already being told without my input. Emily eventually said the words outright, that they were planning to move into the penthouse, that it would be good for Mark, good for their daughter, good for me. She said it with a reassuring smile, as if anticipating resistance and smoothing it away before it could form. Mark nodded then. Still didn't look at me. Just nodded once, slow and deliberate. I waited. I let the silence stretch. Years ago, I'd learned that silence unsettles people more than anger ever does. Emily filled it quickly, explaining timelines, how soon they'd start bringing things over, how they'd make sure not to disrupt me too much. The phrasing struck me. Not if, when. I glanced at Mark, searching for something familiar in his face. Some flicker of hesitation. Some acknowledgement that this was my life they were rearranging. But he stayed quiet, hands clasped, gaze lowered. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to accept before. His silence wasn't confusion. It was consent. The humiliation didn't come from what they were proposing. It came from how confidently they did it in front of strangers. From the way Emily's voice carried. From the way Mark allowed her to speak for him. From the subtle suggestion that this was all being done for me, whether I understood it or not. When the conversation ended, Emily stood first, already gathering her coat. She squeezed my shoulder and said we'd talk more later, somewhere more comfortable. Mark murmured goodbye, still avoiding my eyes. They left together, coordinated, aligned. I stayed behind, coffee untouched, watching the door swing closed behind them. Around me, the cafe returned to its normal rhythm. Cups clinked. Someone laughed. Life moved on. I sat there a long time after that, feeling not angry, not even sad, but quietly displaced. Like someone had walked into my life, rearranged the furniture while I was still sitting in the room, and expected gratitude for the effort. By the time I stood to leave, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever they thought they had already decided, they had underestimated how much of my life I had deliberately put in writing. They came back 2 days later, this time without pretense. No cafe. No soft language. No attempt to frame the meeting as emotional repair. Emily sent a message saying they needed to go over logistics and asked what time worked for me. The phrasing was clinical, efficient. It assumed access. It assumed cooperation. I told them to come by in the afternoon. When they arrived, Emily carried a slim folder tucked under her arm, the kind used for presentations. Mark followed with nothing in his hands, which struck me immediately. He used to show up with something, paperwork, a notebook, even groceries. Now he arrived empty, as if his role had been reduced to physical presence alone. They sat at my dining table like they'd rehearsed it. Emily placed the folder in front of her, squared it with the edge of the table, and opened it carefully. Inside were printed layouts of my apartment. Floor plans, measurements, each room labeled in clean, sans serif font. She didn't ask if she could begin. She simply did. Emily spoke in bullet points, literally and figuratively. Bedroom allocations, storage adjustments, a proposed timeline for moving furniture. She referred to my study as flex space, my bedroom as the primary for now. She spoke as if the apartment were an asset undergoing reorganization, not a home shaped by grief and intention. Mark finally spoke then, but only briefly. He mentioned debts, instability at work, rising costs. He framed everything as temporary, a short-term solution that would benefit everyone. He didn't look at me when he said it. He stared at the floor plan like it was a map he was trying to memorize. Emily picked up where he left off, translating his uncertainty into structure. She talked about efficiency, safety, and how sharing space would reduce stress. She said my age once casually, as if it were a relevant data point. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way people cite weather conditions, something factual, something to be accounted for. As she spoke, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't improvisation. This had been prepared. Decisions had been made elsewhere, likely over multiple conversations I hadn't been part of. What I was witnessing wasn't negotiation. It was implementation. I asked a single question quietly. When did you decide this? Emily paused, just long enough to recalibrate. She said they'd been talking about it for a while, that it felt like the natural next step. Mark nodded again, still not looking at me. I looked down at the floor plan in front of me. My furniture had been reassigned in neat text boxes. Items I recognized immediately. The armchair I'd had reupholstered after my wife died. The bookshelf I'd built myself now existed as movable objects in someone else's plan. Emily slid another page forward. A suggested reallocation of bedrooms. She proposed that I move into the smaller room down the hall. Closer to the bathroom, she said. Safer. Quieter. She said it gently, like a concession, like something she expected gratitude for. Mark said nothing. In that moment, the betrayal crystallized. Not emotional betrayal that had already happened in the cafe. This was procedural. This was authority being claimed on paper, with ink and alignment and certainty. This was my life being reorganized without my consent, under the guise of care. I realized then that if I objected emotionally, I would lose. Emily was prepared for that. She would soothe, redirect, explain. If I objected angrily, I would confirm whatever narrative she had already built about my resistance, my difficulty, my inability to adapt. So I said nothing. Silence, I've learned, is not passive. It's observational. Emily continued, undeterred. She mentioned my granddaughter as motivation. How this would give her stability. How important it was to think long-term. She didn't say love. She said outcomes. She didn't say family. She said planning. I watched Mark closely then. The boy I raised used to argue. He used to push back. Even when he was wrong, he had opinions. Now he sat beside his wife, hands folded, allowing her to claim ground he knew wasn't hers. When Emily finally finished, she looked up at me expectantly, pen poised above the paper as if waiting for approval. For a signature. For something to formalize what she already believed was inevitable. I met her gaze and nodded once. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. They left shortly after, the folder tucked back under her arm. Emily looked satisfied, already moving on to the next step in her head. Mark lingered at the door for a moment, like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. When the door closed, I remained seated at the table, staring at the empty space where those papers had been. I didn't feel shocked anymore. I felt clear. That night I took out my own files. Not floor plans. Not proposals. Documents I hadn't looked at in years. Things my wife and I had put in place quietly, deliberately, when we still believed preparation was a form of love. And for the first time since breakfast, I stopped reacting. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. Occupations rarely begin with force. They begin with permission implied, with small intrusions that test boundaries and measure resistance. Emily understood that instinctively. She returned alone the following afternoon, saying she wanted to talk through a few details. I hadn't invited her, but she arrived anyway, key fob in hand, already letting herself into the building as if access had been settled. By the time she knocked on my door, she was already inside my life again. She walked through the apartment slowly, deliberately, not admiring it, assessing it. Her eyes moved over surfaces, corners, framed photographs. She paused in the living room longer than necessary, standing in front of the photo of my wife that sat on the sideboard. The one taken a year before she died. Soft light. Her smile tired but genuine. Emily touched the frame. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost tender. That made it worse. She said it might be time to declutter emotionally. She phrased it like advice she'd read somewhere reputable. Said holding on to too many reminders could prevent growth. She didn't ask how long my wife had been gone. She didn't need to. The suggestion was already loaded with implication, that my grief had exceeded its acceptable duration. I watched her fingers rest on the glass, and something in me hardened quietly. She moved on without waiting for a response, walking toward the hallway, opening doors. The guest room first, then my study. She commented on lighting, on storage, on how spaces could be repurposed to better suit a family environment. She didn't ask whether I wanted a family environment. She assumed it was preferable to whatever solitude I'd constructed. When she reached the bedroom, she lingered again. She mentioned safety, said the smaller room down the hall would be easier for me as I got older. Less walking, less risk. She spoke about my age again, this time more pointedly, as if it were a diagnosis rather than a number. I realized then that she was building a case. Not for me, against me. Each comment, each suggestion, was another brick in a structure designed to justify displacement. It wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. She mentioned my granddaughter next. Not affectionately, strategically. Said children needed consistency, stability, that seeing me every day would be good for her, that having her grandparents under one roof would normalize things during a difficult time. She didn't say I loved her. She said it would motivate me. That was the moment my home stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling occupied. Emily moved into the kitchen and opened cabinets. She talked about reorganizing pantry space, about childproofing, about how much easier it would be once everything was streamlined. She spoke like someone already living there, already adapting the environment to her needs. I leaned against the counter and listened. I let her speak herself into clarity. When she finally paused, she looked at me expectantly again, waiting for affirmation, approval, gratitude. I asked her one question. When did you decide my home needed to change? She smiled, patient, controlled. Said change was inevitable, that resisting it only caused stress, that Mark and I would both be happier if I trusted her instincts. There it was, the quiet audacity of it. Trust her instincts over my lived experience, over decades of independence, over a lifetime of managing my own affairs competently. I thought of my wife then, of the conversations we'd had near the end, when illness forced us to discuss contingencies we'd rather have avoided. She'd been meticulous, not anxious, intentional. She'd said more than once that people often confused kindness with weakness, and that preparation was not pessimism. It was protection. Emily didn't know any of that. She saw an older man living alone and mistook stillness for vulnerability. Before she left, she asked about spare keys. Said it would make things easier once they started bringing items over. I told her I'd think about it. She accepted that answer the way people accept delays when they already believe the outcome is fixed. That evening, after the apartment was quiet again, I stood in the hallway and looked at the doors she'd opened, the spaces she'd mentally reassigned, the photograph she'd touched. I understood then that this wasn't about space. It was about authority, about who had the right to decide what happened next in my life. And for the first time, I felt something close to resolve. Not anger, not fear, preparation. That night, my phone rang just after 10. It was my estate lawyer. His voice was tight, careful in the way professionals sound when they're about to deliver something that changes the terrain. He said a document had surfaced, a power of attorney, recently filed. He said my name was on it. He said Emily's was too. And he said I had never signed it. That was when the situation stopped being personal and became procedural. And that was when I knew my wife had been right to plan for people exactly like this. The call from my lawyer didn't come with drama. No raised voice, no rushed warning. That alone told me the situation was serious. Men like him don't tighten their tone unless they're already measuring consequences. He asked if I was alone. I said I was. He told me to stay that way. He explained that a power of attorney had been submitted earlier that week, naming Emily as the acting party. My name was listed as the grantor. Mark was listed as the witness. The document had been notarized, scanned, and filed. On paper, it looked clean, efficient, irrevocable, except for one detail. I had never signed it. I told him that calmly, not defensively, just as a fact. He paused, then said he had suspected as much. The signature was close enough to pass a casual glance, but wrong in ways only familiarity could catch. The pressure inconsistent, the angle off, the flourish at the end missing. Subtle errors but meaningful ones. He said the document granted broad authority. Financial decisions, property access, medical input, the kind of control people only discover they've lost once it's already been exercised. He said that if it had gone unchallenged, Emily could have legally overridden my objections to nearly everything she had already proposed. I listened without interrupting. I'd negotiated contracts for decades. I understood what was being described. This wasn't preparation. It was preemption. He told me he'd frozen the filing pending verification, that he'd flagged it internally and reached out to the notary for confirmation. He said there were inconsistencies in the timestamps, irregularities in the witness record. Enough to raise questions. Enough to slow things down. Then he said something that shifted everything. Your wife anticipated this. He explained that several years earlier, my wife had quietly amended her estate instructions. Not dramatically, not with suspicion. She had simply added contingencies, clauses that activated under specific conditions, provisions that required secondary verification if any authority over me was ever challenged or transferred under questionable circumstances. She had also named an intermediary, someone outside our immediate circle, someone I had never met. At the time, she had told my lawyer it wasn't distrust. It was pattern recognition. She had seen situations like this unfold in other families. She believed that people under stress often made choices they justified as necessary, even when they crossed lines they would otherwise respect. He said that intermediary had already been notified. After the call ended, I sat in the darkened living room, the city lights glowing through the windows. I thought about my wife, about how quietly she had done everything, how little she had needed recognition, how she had prepared not for her own death, but for the years I would have to navigate without her. Emily had mistaken my solitude for isolation, my calm for passivity. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was reorganizing itself, moving from reaction to strategy. The next day, I received an email from someone named Claire. She was my wife's sister. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. Not out of conflict, just distance, geography, different rhythms of life. She lived across the river, in a quieter part of the state. The email was brief, direct. She said my wife had asked her to keep certain records, and that it was time we spoke. We agreed to meet in a diner just past the bridge. Neutral ground. No assumptions. Claire looked older than I remembered, but steadier. She ordered coffee black and didn't waste time. She slid a slim folder across the table and told me my wife had contacted her years ago after attending a support group with a friend. A group for people who had survived financial and legal manipulation by family members. My wife hadn't gone because she suspected anyone. She had gone because she believed in learning from other people's mistakes. Inside the folder were records, not about Emily, not directly, about patterns. There was documentation from another state, another older man, another marriage, another arrangement framed as care. The same structure, gradual access, emotional framing, legal instruments introduced quietly, power of attorney, asset redirection, isolation masked as support. The case had been sealed, settled quietly, no criminal charges, just consequences that rippled outward and disappeared from public view. My wife had found it unsettling enough to prepare. Claire said my wife never confronted Emily. She never accused. She simply built defenses. She believed confrontation without leverage was wasted energy. She believed in preparation over conflict. As Claire spoke, something in me settled. Not anger, understanding. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding or overreach. I was dealing with a method, one refined through repetition. Claire told me my wife had asked her to act only if something felt wrong, not if something went wrong. She said my wife trusted my judgment, trusted that I would know when the line had been crossed. When I left the diner, the sky was overcast. The river below the bridge moved steadily, indifferent to everything above it. I felt the same way, steady, detached. Emily thought she was ahead of me. She thought the paperwork was leverage. She thought my silence was surrender. What she didn't understand was that I had stopped reacting entirely. Once you understand that you're not facing impulse but pattern, your posture changes. Emotion becomes irrelevant. What matters then is sequencing, timing, evidence. I didn't confront Emily. I didn't warn Mark. I didn't change my behavior in any visible way. I continued exactly as before, calm, cooperative, distant. That was important. People who rely on control are attuned to disruption. Any deviation would have alerted her that something wasn't going according to plan. Instead, I began documenting every message Emily sent, every suggestion framed as concern, every reference to my age, my memory, my supposed need for support. I saved voicemails. I forwarded emails to my lawyer. I logged dates, times, phrasing. Not because I needed reassurance, but because documentation turns behavior into record. At the same time, my lawyer moved quietly. The notary who had authenticated the forged power of attorney was contacted. The response was hesitant at first, then defensive. The signature appointment had allegedly taken place during a time window I could conclusively prove I was elsewhere. Receipts, security logs, building access records. The kind of things people don't think to fabricate because they forget how traceable modern life is. The document unraveled quickly after that. Not publicly, not dramatically. It simply lost standing. What mattered more was what we uncovered next. Emily had attempted to access my financial accounts under the assumption that the power of attorney would be processed without challenge. Preliminary inquiries, soft requests, framed as administrative cleanup. She hadn't succeeded, but the attempts were logged. That detail mattered. Intent always matters more than outcome. Meanwhile, Claire provided more context. Not speculation. Records, court summaries, affidavits from prior cases that never reached trial. The same emotional vocabulary repeated across years. The same justifications. Care, stability, family obligation, always paired with legal instruments introduced gradually, framed as temporary, then left in place long enough to become permanent. Emily had not invented this approach. She had refined it. My wife had suspected none of this directly. What she had recognized was the risk profile, a dominant personality, comfort with control, a tendency to speak for others. Those were the red flags she had prepared against. One evening, while reviewing trust documents with my lawyer, I learned something Emily did not know. The penthouse was not solely mine to give. After my wife died, ownership had been restructured. Not out of secrecy, out of efficiency. The property was held in a family trust with conditions attached to residency changes. Any permanent alteration to occupancy required consensus from trustees, one of whom was not me. That trustee was Mark, and the originals were not in Emily's possession. Mark had signed as witness on the forged power of attorney, but he had not authorized any changes to the trust. Whether through ignorance or hesitation, he had failed to complete the very step Emily assumed he had. That was the first real crack in her narrative. I didn't exploit it immediately. I waited. Emily's behavior escalated subtly once she sensed resistance she couldn't name. She began asking more directly for spare keys. She referenced moving dates again. She suggested bringing my granddaughter by more often to help me adjust. Each suggestion was another test, probing for compliance. I declined gently, always gently. Eventually, she stopped asking and started demanding. That was when I knew the moment was approaching. I arranged for Mark to come by alone one evening under the pretense of reviewing some old paperwork. He arrived tired, guarded. He looked older than his years, worn thin by the strain of carrying decisions he hadn't fully made himself. I didn't accuse him. I didn't confront him with documents. I simply laid out facts. The forged power of attorney, the blocked access attempts, the trust structure, the legal exposure he faced as a listed witness. I watched him absorb it slowly, painfully. For the first time in months, he looked at me, not with defiance, with fear. I told him I wasn't angry, that I wasn't interested in punishment, that I needed to know one thing only, whether he understood what had been set in motion, and whether he was willing to stop it. He didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched between us, heavy but honest. Finally, he nodded. Once. That nod mattered more than anything Emily had ever said. He left without making promises. I didn't need promises. I needed alignment. 2 days later, Emily showed up unannounced, demanding spare keys and access codes. Her tone was sharper now, less curated. She referenced my memory again, my health, She suggested we formalize things before they became complicated. I told her to sit. She didn't like that. I placed the forged document on the table between us. She smiled at first, dismissive. Then she saw the annotations, the flags, the legal markings she hadn't expected. Her smile thinned. She questioned my recollection, my understanding. She suggested stress had distorted my interpretation. Then the door opened. Mark walked in. He carried a sealed envelope. Inside were originals Emily had never seen. The trust documents. Signed. Verified. Irrevocable. The penthouse was not an asset to be absorbed. It was protected. Structured. Conditioned. Emily's authority evaporated in real time. Not with shouting. Not with accusation. With paper. She tried to speak. Mark spoke first. Not loudly. Not angrily. Clearly. That was the end of her control. And the beginning of the quiet dismantling she never anticipated. Emily didn't raise her voice when Mark walked in. That surprised me. She straightened instead, the way people do when they believe composure will save them. Control had always been her armor, and she reached for it instinctively. Mark closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He placed the envelope on the table and slid it forward, stopping just short of her hands. The sound it made against the wood was soft, almost polite, but it cut through the room more sharply than any argument could have. Emily glanced at it once, then back at me. She asked what this was supposed to prove. Her tone suggested impatience, not concern. She was still operating under the assumption that authority belonged to whoever spoke most confidently. I told her to open it. She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough for her to realize that whatever advantage she thought she had was no longer guaranteed. When she finally did, her posture shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. The way a person reacts when they recognize something they hadn't planned for. She flipped through the documents quickly at first, scanning rather than reading. Then slower. Then she stopped altogether. Mark spoke then. Not to me, to her. He said the originals had been stored separately, as required. He said he had never authorized occupancy changes. He said he had not consented to asset consolidation. He said the trust terms were clear, and that he had confirmed them with counsel. Emily looked at him as if he were someone she no longer recognized. She asked why he hadn't told her about this before. He didn't answer directly. He said he hadn't understood the full scope of what she was doing until recently. He said he had trusted her framing. He said he had been wrong. That admission mattered. Not legally, morally. Emily turned back to me. She questioned my memory again, more sharply this time. Suggested I had misunderstood the documents. That stress and grief could distort perception. That these things happen to people my age. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence do its work. Then I showed her the annotations. The flagged inconsistencies. The notary inquiry. The access attempts. Each one documented. Each one timestamped. Her face changed then. Not fear. Calculation. She shifted strategies, moved from denial to negotiation. She said this had all been a misunderstanding. That she had only been trying to help. That families sometimes stumbled when under pressure. She suggested we reset. That we start fresh. That perhaps things had moved too quickly. Mark didn't look at her. I told her there would be no reset. I explained calmly that the power of attorney had been invalidated. That any further attempts to act on my behalf without authorization would constitute interference. That the trust structure prevented any occupancy changes without consensus. That the documentation now existed independently of my cooperation. I didn't threaten her. I didn't need to. I told her I was asking for one thing only: distance. Emily stood abruptly. She said she needed time to process this. She said she felt attacked. She said she hadn't expected this level of resistance. Resistance. The word struck me. She gathered her things, movements sharper now, less curated. At the door, she turned back once and said this wasn't over. I told her it was. She left without another word. Mark stayed. We didn't talk much. There was nothing theatrical to say. He apologized once. Quietly, without qualifiers. I accepted it not because everything was repaired, but because acknowledgement matters. Legal steps followed in the days after, methodical and silent. Access was revoked. Filings were corrected. Notifications were issued. Emily lost authority first, then proximity, then leverage. The process was uneventful, which is how real resolution often looks. Mark moved out shortly after. Not dramatically, just distance and responsibility. He began repairing what he could, starting with his daughter. She remained untouched by the mess, which had always been my priority. The apartment returned to stillness. Not emptiness. Stability. I went back to having breakfast alone. Coffee cooling at my own pace. Sunlight where I wanted it. Silence that belonged to me. And for the first time in a long while, that solitude felt intentional. The aftermath did not announce itself. There were no confrontations, no public reckonings, no raised voices echoing through hallways. Resolution, I learned again, is rarely loud. It arrives quietly, through paperwork completed, access revoked, patterns interrupted. Within a week, the legal corrections were finalized. The forged power of attorney was formally invalidated. Notifications were sent to every institution Emily had contacted or attempted to contact. My lawyer handled it efficiently, the way competent people do when they know exactly where the fault lines run. There were no accusations made publicly. No need for them. The record spoke clearly enough. Emily's presence faded in stages. First access, keys, codes, permissions, then proximity, then finally relevance. Each layer stripped away without ceremony. She attempted one last email, framed as concern, suggesting mediation, suggesting miscommunication. My lawyer replied on my behalf. Briefly, decisively. There was nothing left to discuss. Mark moved out not long after. He didn't announce it either. He packed quietly, took what was his, left the rest. We spoke once more before he went. Not about blame. About responsibility. He told me he was going to take time. Rebuild trust where it mattered. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deserve absolution yet. What he deserved was the opportunity to do better. I gave him that. My granddaughter remained blissfully untouched by any of it. That had always been my line. Whatever adults chose to destroy, she would not be collateral. Visits continued on my terms, supervised and uncomplicated. She laughed. She played. She knew nothing of documents or betrayal or control. That was how it should be. The penthouse settled back into its rhythm. Objects returned to being just objects, not leverage. The photo of my wife remained where it had always been. Untouched. Unapologetic. I noticed that in the weeks after, I spoke to her photograph more often. Not out loud. Internally. Telling her she had been right. Thanking her for seeing further than I ever had. I rearranged nothing. That mattered to me. The apartment didn't need reclaiming because it had never truly been taken. It only needed boundaries reasserted. Breakfast returned to being my own. I stopped rushing through it. Let the coffee cool if I wanted. Let the silence stretch. I realized then how much of my discomfort before hadn't come from being alone, but from being gradually crowded out of my own life without acknowledgement. Solitude is different from isolation. One is chosen. The other is imposed. I had chosen again. Occasionally I thought about Emily. Not with anger. With clarity. People like her don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as organizers of chaos, managers of inefficiency. They believe outcomes justify methods, that resistance is proof of ignorance rather than autonomy. Understanding that removed any lingering resentment. You don't hate a storm for behaving like weather. You just build stronger structures. My wife had done exactly that. Months later, my lawyer called to confirm the file was closed. No further action pending. No residual risk. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth. That I was calm. That I slept well. That my life felt aligned again. After the call, I stood by the window and watched the city move. People going places. Making plans. crossing lines they didn't always see. I felt no urge to reinsert myself into anyone else's urgency. I had learned something valuable late but not too late. Authority over one's life is not something you announce. It's something you maintain quietly, through preparation, boundaries, and the willingness to act without spectacle. I went back to my table, poured another cup of coffee, and sat down alone. Not abandoned, not diminished, intentional. And that, I realized, was the justice my wife had planned for all along.